All right, welcome to our NAL at ED budget revision workshop. I know budget revisions are not necessarily the most riveting topic for everybody, but I do know that you will find this informational and hopefully helpful as you're doing your own budget revisions. So I appreciate you taking the time to be with us this morning, afternoon, depending on where you are. So as we get started today, we're going to talk through a few fiscal basics, and then we'll dive down into breaking down your budgets and the various pieces and parts, and then talk about how to develop your own budget revision and leaving some time there at the end for your questions and answers. So as we go along, pop your questions over into the chat box. We'll try to take those as we're going, but we'll definitely at least get to them during the Q&A time. So if you haven't found the chat box, just look at the bottom for the little people, and that will open up the chat box, and you can put your questions in as we're going along. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Angela Hernandez-Marshall.
Thank you. I'm assuming everybody can hear me. You can just nod. I think I see. Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for joining us, guys, today. Next slide. Want to talk about some basics, but I'm really hoping you're going to see a lot of the slides that we've been sharing over some of the other post-award presentations. You might have seen them more than once because maybe you have another OIE grant. But as we talk through some of these basics today, I really want you to walk away with two things. One is I want you to walk away with a shared understanding of, what we mean when we're using certain terms, federal terms, and the terminology and the nomenclature that we use for our budget process. It can be overwhelming. I just came off of a training, for instance, on another completely different, unrelated federal process, and walked away with my head spinning with all of the, unfamiliar and uncommon terms, except for what's needed for that process. So I say that to say, as we talk through, I really want to just focus on budgets really as they relate to the kinds of projects that you guys have proposed to do. I might call or ask for volunteers from our incumbents, from our grantees that we've awarded in the past, specifically for NAL grants, just to give some feedback on what you wish you knew then that you know now. And really kind of hone in on what I saw most of you guys providing or putting the resources, meaning in which budget federal categories, so we can talk specifically about those categories and the implications for changes, carryover, all that good stuff. Okay, next slide, please. So we've talked about what's allowable, and by and large, when we gave you again that said, here's your funding, anything that you proposed, unless you saw a cut, you can presume that everything you proposed in your budgets was allowable. If it was not allowable, you would have seen reductions in the final amount that we gave you versus what you proposed. In some cases, it's obvious what the reductions are for. In some others, it's not. I'm going to talk in generalities, but in general, I'll give you 3 reasons you might have seen a cut. One is because you requested construction costs. These are non-construction federal grants, so we do not allow any construction costs. We would have said no if, for example, maybe you entered a series of costs and budget numbers in that Ed 524 form, which is that standard form with the 5 years of budgets, even though it's 3 years for your program. But you would have seen that if that looked different from the numbers that you placed in your budget narrative, for instance, we would have gone with what you went in the 524. We would have stuck with whatever it was that you had described, i.e. becomes justifiable. So just to keep in mind some of those, when you see some of those cuts, if you proposed a number, but you don't justify it in the narrative, it would not have been approved. So those are some quick ones that I'll just share out, just sort of in general, but we can talk about your grant specific cuts one-on-one. on calls with me. Next slide, please. So reasonable and necessary. Again, most of you, all of you, frankly, had plenty of reasonable, necessary, allowable costs. We recognize, and especially with OIE grants, we certainly recognize where costs might look higher. For instance, travel, if you're in a remote location, or materials might be more expensive, if you're in a remote area of Alaska, for instance. So there's any number of sort of unique situations and circumstances that for the most part in your narratives, you all have done a good job of describing what those are. Reasonable and necessary, the costs that we saw by and large are the expected costs that we see, which is one, personnel. We see you proposing personnel, not just for the project director role, of course, but for two other types of roles typically in a NAL grant. One is for your native language instructors, whether they be teachers, whether they maybe be elders on salary, or other individuals with professional experience and expertise in the native language that you're proposing to support. The third item might be for something different, and we're going to talk about this, and this has to do more with stipends and the use of payment for services of otherwise salaried individuals. So we'll get to that in a minute. And again, they're prudent. We saw nothing really unreasonable in terms of those costs related to personnel. Supplies, definitely, we expect that you need and will use supplies. Contracts, very common because you're looking for contract support often for curriculum development or for evaluation purposes, etc. So there's any number of reasons that I know you guys would have proposed contracts. We'll get to this other issue anyway, but later on when we look at the specific budget categories. But I do want to call out the appropriate place for you to charge or indicate what your stipend costs are in the case of stipends. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Next slide. Allocable. So again, we've talked about this quite a bit, but typically you have to think about allocability when it's you guys, for instance, where you're a project director splitting your time across other programs or projects or just other work in general. It's really important to have that accurate FTE, that percentage of time, and you should see that percentage of time for the project director on record on your GAN, remember. So that would be under that, all that initial demographic characteristic information on your GAN on the first page. You would have key personnel and you should see a percentage of time assigned. If that percentage of time is not correct and needs to be updated, please let me know. Please feel free to send me an email and we'll update that accordingly. But we took that percentage, just as an FYI, that percentage that you see on your GAN now comes from the original approved application. So just want to make note of that. The other reason that you would have allocable costs, again, are typically for supplies. So the slide here shows the laptop example, but there might be other examples. So for instance, if you knew and you proposed in your original approved budget, for example, the use of headphones, the use of wireless devices, the use of supplies related to remote learning. If that was incorporated into your grant, again, it's an allocable issue, meaning that you should be paying from this grant only for the percentage or proportion of use that the student or the adult has need for. Meaning if they're using it for 5 other, subject areas over the course of the day, you'd be trying to allocate only 1/6 of that cost to those particular supplies or items when it comes to the distance learning or remote instruction. So again, we can talk more about that, but And if it's full immersion, obviously full day all the time, then yes, then it should be 100%. But I know for most of you, that would be an allocability issue because most of you are not at 100%. Next slide. We've talked about these training items and these training resources on these web pages. I really can't stress enough that first link, which takes you to the ed.gov, the older ed.gov site, but it has a whole series of webinars and PowerPoint presentations for you to just take and get. It's certainly useful to your finance staff. So if they're not sure about some things, I guarantee you the answer will be there. There's a lot of FAQs in that section. That was established back in 2015 when we first updated to uniform guidance across the federal government. But again, those are still relevant and active materials. So please make sure that you're going to look at that. The actual regulations are at the second link, that ECFR link. So that's where you'll find the actual language about cost principles and what's allowable, what's not. And that gets more into the Fed speak. So unless you feel comfortable with Fed speak, you might want to stick to the ed training resources as a starting point. And then finally, there are some training modules at cfo.gov, which can walk you through both basics and different advanced items, depending on your need. So just want to keep sending those your way just as a go-to. And if you come across stuff that you have questions about, or you think there's conflicting information, or you're not sure, again, feel free to let me know and we can work with you on that. Next slide. All right, so let's talk about breaking down your budget. Next slide. We've talked about where you can find the money that you know you got for this particular budget year, year 1 of 3. Next slide. Now, federal budget categories. So again, if you recall in your application, you would have seen that Ed 524 form, and that's where, you know, these clear budget categories are. Most of you, I will say, had personnel, fringe, some travel, and I'll just caveat, for some of you, most of you did provide funds, for example, for all 3 years, as you should, travel for, at minimum, the project director on record with a grant to be able to attend annual project director meetings that the department sponsors. Where did we ask for this? We asked you to do this in the notice inviting applications. So if for some reason you don't see funds allocated there, or that's not what you initially did, please be sure that you're trying to plan for that. The caveat, of course, is this year. You might recall from our first event that we talked about, and the first couple of events, we talked about a virtual project directors meeting this year. So in fact, some of you who did in fact budget for those travel funds for the project director to attend a meeting, they're not going to need those travel funds this year 1 because we're doing it virtually. So already you're at a point where you're going to have some travel funds that you're able to shift either to another budget category because you're allowed to do that, as we discussed in the post-award event, or you can leave it in travel and use it for a different allowable purpose. And allowable purpose would be a purpose that you talked about in your original approved application, needing funds. Let's say, for instance, you're the project coordinator. You've got to go across 3 different schools to support this work. And that would allow you to maybe shift more funds to do more of those visits, or to invite more people, maybe your instructors for professional development purposes need to travel somewhere and you have some funds, but that gives you a little more cushion in case you need those travel funds. Again, alternatively, if there's another need that you've identified, and I'm just going to make this up, I know somebody somewhere asked me, we've got higher fringe than we expected this year. Our original budget had an estimate. You could move those travel funds there to that fringe to help meet that deficit that you now have. Equipment, nobody really should have equipment, and an equipment, we'll get into that, is just a cost higher than $5,000 per unit. All of you pretty much had supplies. Contractual, again, we talked about. Other would be, for instance, where your institution or your agency, your district, your school chooses to, for example, they might have a salaried teacher, but maybe you're paying that teacher a stipend to attend a summer workshop or a summer session or some other PD activity, in which case you would put that stipend in other, because it's not something against which you're also adding fringe, for instance. It's not really part of that salaried cost. So you could put that in other. We also see things like we often have many of our schools who choose to hire or either for an isolated activity or maybe over the course of the long term, elders or other tribal leaders to support language instruction and materials development, and maybe you're paying them a stipend. That stipend cost also could go under other. It could also go under contractual, depending on the nature, and I would default to your institution policies for about which line item that they would choose to do that. Okay. And indirect costs, we've talked about ad nauseum. At the very bottom of the Ed 524 form, you see a training line item. That training is not applicable to this program because training actually means costs for things like college tuition, et cetera, and that's not part of this program. So training in the sense of professional development costs would be, again, under either contractual or other typically, and not in that training section. Next slide. And I don't see any questions in the chat box, Sarah, but you can feel free to stop me here or at any point if you see something come up that I missed.
Great, I will.
So under personnel, again, it's everybody that you're paying for. These are typically the job roles that we see reflected in most NAL projects, NAL Ed projects. So the director, sort of maybe, higher level oversight versus maybe the project coordinator, who might be that person that's really doing a lot more of that day-to-day program implementation work. Teacher, teacher aide, curriculum writer, substitutes. So that's another place, by the way, that sometimes we see substitutes under personnel. Sometimes we see that under other. Again, we're not so cut and dry about. I think it's really dependent on you and the needs and the appropriateness for your budgeting purposes. Again, denoting the amount of time that's dedicated to the project is really important for any roles that you have, and all of you did that in your budget narrative, so thank you. Next slide. Extra duty pay, so that comes back to my point about it might be a contracted item that your budget office chooses to use it as, or put it under other if we call it a stipend. Again, that's really dependent on your end, and we're not prescriptive about that. Just be consistent about where you assign that particular cost. The budget in your proposal likely use that average salary estimation. So again, if there are changes to those salaries, when we talk about budget revision shortly, that's really the kind of budget revisions we would expect to be seeing now. And I'll talk a little bit more about the salary issues in a minute. Next slide. Fringe. So again, I did hear from an actual grantee who said our fringe cost was higher. Again, so two very important things about this. One is you're absolutely allowed to shift funds in order to meet that unexpected cost or additional cost that was just based on estimate. But understand it's a shifting of cost. You cannot sort of submit that request and expect that you're going to get additional funds to cover that fringe cost, because your approved cost is your approved cost. So just want to be really clear about that, that any additional personnel costs, fringe costs, even contractual costs, if they are different, i.e. higher than what you had in your original approved application, you will have to identify funds from another budget category to shift in order to make up for that deficit, okay? Conversely, if you get an actual fringe amount and you see that it's far lower, that's an opportunity to assign those funds, to shift those funds to another budget category, depending on where you think that greatest need is, okay? Next slide. Travel expenses, we talked about that, all the stuff that goes into traveling, and certainly consistent with your own institution or agencies or district's policies around travel costs. We ask that you follow the GSA per diem rates there, or your organization's policy. If it's slightly different, they're usually pretty comparable. But if you happen to see something crazy or different, you can let us know. Clearly, we wouldn't expect the costs coming from, North Carolina to be the same as to DC, the same as Alaska. So, those costs are going to be highly variable. We get that. And again, especially in this time of COVID, my caution would be, pausing on the rush for purchase of travel related costs until and your agency has a policy around how they would treat, for example, reimbursements, et cetera. That's not money we're going to make up for. So just be aware of that. You don't want to do that too far in advance. Next slide. So travel, allocating funds, we talked about that for a project director meeting this year. It's a no-go. So you already, if you budgeted for those funds in your narrative in the approved application, you're already ahead of the game. You have a few extra dollars to allocate to something that will help you implement your project. Other potential travel expenses. In some applications, we see, folks proposing, we want to be able to attend this conference or that conference or training event. Again, if we get to this time next year, for instance, and I know that some of you, for example, had NIEA as a conference that you want to take some of your native language teachers to for obvious purposes. If, in fact, it becomes remote again, you might still be paying a registration cost, but of course you would not have those travel costs. So it's things like that to be thinking about, planning accordingly and just being prepared. We typically do not allow international travel expense to be charged to the grant, so just an FYI on that. Next slide. Equipment versus supplies. So I won't go into detail and just ask if there are any questions about this. I think it's pretty straightforward for most folks. Next slide. Next slide. So contracts. External organizations, right, or folks that you have an agreement with, we talked about this, they tend to be for curriculum, instructional materials that I've seen. And I'm going to pause here for a second. And Sarah, just to give us a chance to all see each other, if you want to throw us in the gallery view. And I might ask if some of our incumbent folks just kind of want to speak to what some of those costs have been that you've used in the contracts category. So I don't want to pick on Brandon or Lisa, but feel free to offer some feedback.
The question was what we use the contracted category for. Okay, so for our program, our last program and our new program, really the two main areas were actually three, to fund our external evaluator, and that would include all of her work, the site visits, as well as all of the documentation and reporting that she did. The other would be the professional development professors or experts that we had hired to lead PD sessions. And then a third category that we're not including in our current program is sort of it wasn't really a sub award, but it was a local agency that we contracted with, and they provided us a staff member that was a a family advocate that we basically paid them to be employed, if that makes sense.
And Brandon, didn't you also have a contract for assessment development?
Oh, yes, good point. Yep. So we were working with a assessment company to develop a UPIC proficiency exam. And so we paid them to do that for us. Good call.
Great. Thank you. Lisa, do you have anything to add to that in terms of contract or even other costs?
Yeah, our last NAL award, we used contractual services of experts, sort of like what Brandon just mentioned. But we also included elders because we need elder fluent speakers to assist our staff with the development of curriculum and assessment and all kinds of things, even PD. So that's what we also added in our last award. But I noticed it's not in this current award. So
got it. So again, some other things to think about that I'll throw out there with respect to things like contract costs. So I've also seen some, and not necessarily with NAL grants, but in other grant programs, situations where, for example, maybe you originally had plans to have a set of teachers developing your curriculum, but in fact, due to time and effort, et cetera, you've decided that you want to shift and have that work contracted out. That's allowable. Why is that allowable? Because it's in the scope of your original approved application. It's just that you're having somebody else do it. So again, provided that you have the cost, that you have the funding available, that's certainly a doable, an allowable use of funds. And again, the reverse is also true. So if you originally had plans to have a contractor developing your curriculum, or as Brenda mentioned in their case, developing an assessment, but in fact, based on maybe the new hires that you have, new teachers, new instructors, they have the experience and the expertise to develop that in-house. You're absolutely able to shift those funds to maybe pay them a higher salary, maybe pay them a stipend in addition to their salaried payment for the purposes of building and developing out that curriculum and assessment work. So again, there's a lot of flexibility for you in that's perfectly allowable. You should know that anytime you come and you're not sure and you want to ask, the first thing I'm going to ask you back is, what page in your application did you say you would do that? That's really sort of the first order of business. Is as long as you presented it in some shape or form, however detailed or not, brief mention or expansive detail about the nature of the work, as long as it's in the application, it supports an allowable cost. It's justification. Working through the details is something that we as program officers are here to do with you. So I can help you work out what's the best way to do that, and certainly can give you some advice based on the strategies that we know that other grantees have used. So just be aware of that there's really a lot of flexibility there for you. What becomes the big no-no over time is the idea of, and I'll just throw this out as a perfect example right now, many of you are in the process of hiring new native language instructors, but you're not there yet. And because the district or the school or the tribe, whoever it is that's authorizing that hire, takes a while. So you might see that you suddenly have 4 months worth of salary available that you did not have before. What do you not want to do? Don't hold on to that money thinking I can just tack it on at the end. The more that you do that, the higher you have of what we call carryover or an unexpended balance, and the greater likelihood that those funds will be cut at time of continuation award, meaning repurpose that funding. Even if it's, I'm going to raise the salary by $100, a pay period, or, $2,000 a year, whatever it is, more salary costs, or maybe hiring more experts to help with the language development work. Whatever it is, really be thinking now, if you know it's going to take you 3 or 4 months to hire, what are you going to do with those funds? What are they going to help you do? It might be, we've got to send that new person to all these new things because we got to ramp them up quickly. So it might be investing in that individual more. It might be turning around and saying, we're going to, hire some other temporary consultants to help us in the interim. There's lots of things that you can do with that. And I'm hoping that over the course of the year, as you have more opportunities to network with your fellow grantees, that you can come up with ideas that are viable, that are reasonable. Do we expect that you're using all and exhausting all those funds? No, not necessarily. We know it takes time, especially in year 1, to start off. But for now, unlike any of our other OIE grant programs, it is only a 3-year program. So there is an expectation that you are doing at least a level of acceleration, a level of ramp up that is probably quicker than most of our other grant programs. So I think if you find yourself stuck or concerned or worried because of circumstances beyond your control, which we all feel like we're in right now, please feel free to give me a call and say, look, we've heard it all. So, we've got, tribal leadership turnover. We know somebody's not going to approve X for at least 3 months. What do I do? So working that through, those are things that I can be here to help you with, those kinds of questions of, I'm thinking about doing X, or I'm thinking about doing Y. And I think Lisa and Brandon can certainly attest to those kinds of conversations that we've had to have. And, I'm probably not available nearly as much as I should be, but know that when it's an important issue, I will get back to you on that and we will talk that through. Sarah and the TA team are a good point of reference as a starting point, but to be clear, anything budget related, it's got to come through us. So ask us the questions and we can get you a swift answer. Okay? Thanks, Sarah. Let's throw it back to the slides.
Yeah, and as we head back to the slides, we actually have a couple questions. So
Okay.
The first one being, so when we're doing these budget revisions, is it a budget revision that's just for this first year, this first performance period, or are we revising our full 3-year grant?
Great question. For the budget revisions we're talking about today, it's budget revisions for this first year, i.e. the funding, the money you have in the bank, right, in G5. So we're not speaking to out years. I think what you might, what doesn't hurt certainly is, for example, I'll stick to the fringe one because it's an easy one. Clearly it went up. It's probably not going back down in terms of costs. And so, and you can let us know, hey, I'm revising it for year 1, but we know it's going to be at least this, and we're going to have to be making these changes in the out years. You can just kind of put a note in the narrative portion of your budget for that, and that should suffice. But really, when we're talking about budget revisions today, and we're going to get to the slide shortly with the template, we're talking about year 1. Okay.
Yeah. And then the second question is, so if a contractor cost increased, can they use the savings that they had in their travel costs to cover that increase in contractor cost?
Yes. And so to be clear, I gave you guys discrete examples of where to shift funds. Funds can be shifted across any of those areas. Again, one, provided that, and I'll give you an example. You can't turn around and say, I just shifted 50% of my project director time, of my cost for project director to contracts. and I'm only going to do 50% now, even though you committed to 100%, because then my next question would be, well, how are you going to get all the work done that you said you needed that 100% FTE for, right? So again, being pragmatic and knowing that I'm going to ask you, well, how are you going to get it done if you don't have X? With travel, it's pretty straightforward. You're not traveling, so we know that, and the funds will go and shift. So again, just where it seems to make sense, provide some justification as to how you know you're covering the rest of what you propose to do, meaning something's not going to suffer, right, as a result of your shifting funds. I hope that's helpful. Next slide, Sarah. And again, just the procurement policies. Remember, we didn't approve anybody in your application. We expect that you're going through your competitive open process in a manner consistent with uniform guidance. Next slide. All the fun about uniform guidance, and then remembering Indian preference for contractors. So I think that goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. So Indian preference for contractors under this program, and really all of our OIE programs. Next slide. So that other category, often I end up seeing supplies or really things that should be contracts, et cetera, or even personnel under that. So other is pretty limited. And for now, I'll just say in the case of NAL and for the context of this project, the projects under this program, it's pretty much stipends. Next slide. And then direct costs, right? So everything that we just talked about thus far. Next slide. Indirect costs, again, you have, I know we don't have a lot of folks with any issues really related to indirect costs, say for 2 or 3. So if you have questions about the follow-up based on the condition assigned to your grant, which you would have identified in the GAN that we walk through, just let me know and we can have a one-on-one conversation. Next slide. Typical indirect expenditures. Again, even if you're not clear about it, your budget staff should be about what falls under indirect. Conversely, here's what I'll say. A lot of times I'll get calls from project directors, or I'll be calling them, for example, with questions based on an APR. And I'll say, tell me about this thing on this budget. And the project director responds, well, I don't do the budget. And my response back is, yeah, but you are the person on the GAN and you're the person I'm going to come to for those questions. So do I need you to be the expert in the budget? No, let me be clear. You are not the expert. You aren't expected to be the expert, but you're expected to be good buddies with the expert, which is the budget folks in your budget office or your finance office, the folks that can give you the right answer. So I'm not expecting everybody to be that. I'm not a budget expert, but I am expecting that you can get that information when needed. I can't stress this enough, and I know our incumbent grantees, I know Brandon, I know Lisa, I know you guys have done this. It is so important that even if you have a budget office keeping track of these expenditures, that if you are the project director, or i.e. you have a project coordinator doing the day-to-day work, that somebody is keeping a ledger on the side so that you have good track, so that if there are discrepancies or issues that come up out of your budget office, you have a point of reference as well. So again, you don't have to be an expert, but you should be knowing what's coming in and out in general. And if you can keep track of that yourself, that makes conversations often with your program officer a lot easier too, because you don't necessarily have to go to your buddy in the budget office to get that answer. So just keep that in mind, that it's really helpful for you to also keep track and not feel like you have to be completely reliant on somebody else for that answer. Next slide. I'm going to skip past that, Sarah. Go past the agreement. Again, we've talked about that kind of ad nauseum, guys. And our point of contact, poor Andre, I'm sure he's getting inundated. And then we said no training, no allow, there are not training costs applicable to this program. Next slide. And then just wanted to share out what are some common no things that you'll hear from me. We don't say no often, but what are the big no's? So the big no's are things like incentives or awards. So as nice as they are, we don't give Barnes & Noble gift cards to kids for, finishing a test, or we don't give trophies out. So those types of incentives or awards are not allowable supplies or any other kind of expenses. Just want to be clear about that. Promotional materials are not either. Meals for program participants. So that is also a no-no. There's no feeding of folks for this and just as an FYI, and we can talk about this, I think Sarah will want to share with our grantees at future events, other, frankly, federal funding sources where you can get that kind of support for meals for program participants. And then we mentioned no international travel. Next slide. So I want to say a little bit more about meals and meetings. This really busy slide takes verbatim some FAQs that we're going to give you a link to as well. But here's the long and short of it. Right now, in real time, with all of us working virtually, there's almost no justification really for meals during meetings because we can go take a break and go to our kitchens respectively or whatever it is we do, depending on where we are. This tends to be guidance, for example, if in the case of a professional development event, which is why I raise it with you guys, because often it's pretty common that you guys propose in your projects, especially over the summer, that you might have sort of an event, a summer session, a workshop, or even, a kind of retreat, if you will, where maybe you have folks as captive audience over the course of, a day and a half or over a weekend or whatever it is. For professional development purposes. And so often you'll be, and I know this has happened both with our professional development program and certainly with NAL, where you might have folks going off to a remote location. It's all self-contained, captive audience, and there's no subway down the street, right? There's no quick, McDonald's. There's nothing there for people to go to. In those very rare circumstances, those would be the things that you'd want to talk with me about with your program officer on a case-by-case basis about the need for meals, meaning it's an all-day event or, again, where people cannot possibly get away. But for the most part, the expectation is people are providing their own meals, snacks, etc. You're not using these funds for that. So I want to be really clear about that. This is something you will always want to talk to me about if you're considering or feeling like needs to be done. Okay. Next slide. And again, in general, folks say paying for networking sessions. No, we're not paying for food for networking sessions or other comparable events. Again, really thinking overarchingly of how is this helping me improve native language proficiency for the students I'm supporting with this grant? I mean, that's really sort of the broader question, regardless of the cost, is what is this doing to get me to achieving those goals and objectives I laid out in my approved application? So hopefully that should help you in kind of asking yourself that question in terms of, again, allowability, appropriateness, etc. Next slide. Big common yeses. So I wanted to talk about all the reasons, and there's many more, but just kind of highlighting some big reasons we say yes for changes. Again, you budgeted for 5 laptops at $2,000 each, and you found laptops on sale for $1,500. So you can move those, again, that's a boon. You have some extra funding, move it to instructional materials or whatever other needs that you've identified across budget categories. The other example Sarah provided here is, for example, it's taking you time to fill certain staffing positions, moving personnel to contractual because it's easier to contract. Maybe it's faster. Maybe you thought you could hire somebody, but it's going to be faster to hire them as a consultant or as contractor. Again, that's the flexibility that you guys have to help sort of expedite the implementation of your project activities. And just to be clear, you can move up to 10% of the entire award. And by entire, not just year one, but the 3 years of the award, of the approved amounts that you had. You can move up to 10%, technically without prior approval. And I would say, yep, you can. That can still be a lot of money. So you might want to let us know that you're doing that, or at minimum, just say, hey, here's my budget revision. This is what we're planning to do, and send us a revised budget. Next slide. I'm going to keep us moving because we've talked about that before, what requires prior approval. And Sarah, I think this is where I turn it over to you.
Yes.
And she's going to walk us through a tool for you. Thanks, Sarah.
Great. So we're going to talk a little bit about the actual nitty-gritty of completing the budget revision. And so we do have a tool available for you. It is an optional tool, but I'll kind of give you the highlights of why you may find it beneficial to take advantage of the tool. So one thing is, the tool already is going to ensure that you're providing all of the information necessary to your program officer for your budget revision to be approved. So if you've completed all the things on here, then that should be all the information that your program officer is going to need to have an approvable budget revision. The second is, it already has magical formulas in it that will do the math for you so that you don't have to worry about the inevitable whoopsies in addition, subtraction, and all of that happen to all of us when we're trying to do these huge budgets. So it will take care of that dilemma for you. Then the other nice thing is, when you go to do your next budget revision, so let's say it gets to be around July and you realize you still have some additional money due to personnel hiring delays and you need to move that. Instead of starting over from scratch, you'll have this document already saved. You can go in and just make a few quick tweaks and send it off and save yourself the hassle of starting over from scratch. So just a couple of things that will hopefully make this very user-friendly and helpful for you. So as we're looking at the form, I just kind of want to walk you through what the various pieces and parts are. So of course, at the top, you're going to include your grantee organization name, your PR award number, and your project director as listed on your GAN. Because remember, that's where everything is for you. That's where everything's kind of housed, is under that PR award, your entity, and your project director. So then as we go down, you'll see we have the budget categories, all the ones that we've talked about today, that is how your budget is already set up. Anywhere where it says expenditure is then where you will put in those line item expenditures. I have a tendency to just put the actual title of the expenditure and keep most of my narrative over to this area just to make it really clean and easy to read. But you're welcome to put as much or as little information there as you want. And then you'll enter it and it will total up each of your categories for you across the way. And we'll go in live and I'll show you exactly how it works as well. So the salmon color here is your existing grant budget. So we sent out the little reminder. So if you have your proposal in front of you, if you look at your current year one grant budget, that's what goes in the salmon column. So exactly as you see it in your proposal. Then as we get over into the green, this is what you want your budget to be or need it to be for this year one. So the first thing are your budget changes. This is where you're going to be moving money out of a line or into a line. So if you know that, you've already hired one teacher and they were actually $5,000 less than what you had anticipated, then you're going to be able to take that out. You'll put that there, or if they were 5,000 more, you'll add it in. It will go ahead and create your revised budget for you. So this total revised budget column, you won't actually type anything in. it's going to create your revised budget for you, because it's going to take what your existing budget was in that salmon color, and it's going to either add or subtract whatever you put in your budget changes and give you that end resulting budget. So the next column that you'll actually type in is this budget revision explanation. So your budget revision explanation is probably the most important part of this form, because if you give really great explanations, then your program officer is going to be able to quickly and easily approve your budget revision. If you write really generic explanations or just write because of COVID, then it'll probably be sent back because there'll be need for additional explanation. So what I mean by that is that you're going to provide a really good explanation of why you're moving monies, either adding or subtracting, and how that aligns to your grant goals and objectives. Because remember, any of these budget revisions that you're making still has to remain within the existing scope of your grant and help you achieve your existing goals and objectives. So just like Angela was saying, if you emailed her a question about the budget, she'd ask you where it was in your grant. You're going to provide that information in this explanation section. Okay.
Sarah,
and I saw you
let me just,
that question.
sorry,
So
I'm going to stop
take
for
it
1
away.
second. Yeah. So Dara, you asked a great question. For any grantees that upon this initial award had funds reduced, it's very possible that even if you have G5 access, you cannot see which budget categories we reduced. So if that's the case, that neither you nor your budget staff are able to see which budget categories were reduced, please set up some time to have a quick call with me, and I will walk you through what those existing, what should go in that salmon colored column, meaning what is originally approved as of now. Okay, so if you have any cuts at all, I will ask you to please get in contact with me so that we can walk through and you can have the correct amounts that are reflected in the G5 system, especially because it's likely you as the project director in particular, if you're doing this exercise, cannot see them. Okay, thank you.
Perfect. And then the other question I saw was getting access to the template. So after our event today, when I send out the slide deck, I'll also send out this form. So you'll get both at the same time. So I do want to show you a quick example so you can kind of see what it would look like filled out. Yours would most likely be a little more wordy. I wanted to make sure it fit on the slide and you could actually read it. So you'll see in particular, notice I've denoted the FTEs of my various roles here. So you can see like my project director is a 0.5 FTE, my teachers are a full FTE. So I think that's a nice way to really clearly show your program officer those FTEs by putting it there in that space versus it being over in your longer narrative. So you'll see things like, okay, my teachers, well, one teacher's salary was less than anticipated. The important thing is that I put that negative when I put in the amount. That's what signals the spreadsheet to subtract that from your amount versus add it to. So with a positive number, you don't have to do anything. It already assumes, but just put that negative if you're subtracting. You'll notice also that I only have narrative in the rows in which I've made a change. So for instance, the project director row, I haven't made any changes. I don't need any further explanation because that was already approved in my grant budget. However, with the teachers and the teaching assistant, those were changes. So if there's anything in that change column, you need an explanation. You'll also see as we go down things like, if you had travel for the PD meeting, you can now recoup that, move that. If you were traveling to a conference that's now virtual, you may only be traveling, paying for that registration fee. It also might just be that you're moving things. So I know some folks originally had like laptops and equipment. Unless you are really buying the fanciest laptop I've seen, it's not going to be over $5,000. So you're going to want to move that back down to supplies. By and large, most things on anyone's grant are going to be supplies versus equipment because of that $5,000 per item piece. You can see, some of you I know had asked previously about the need to purchase possibly some additional cleaning or face mask items due to COVID. So if you have some funds maybe that you recouped through not traveling, you could add some additional supply expenses for things like that. As well as if your indirect cost rate has changed, which they have a tendency to change fairly often, then you may have a change there. So it may be that you originally thought you needed this amount and it may have gone up or down. Make sure to also denote that and make sure in your explanation to explain that it went up or down, remembering that any change in your indirect cost rate agreement, you will also need to provide that documentation to your program officer. So I'm going to switch and actually show you the live form just so you can quickly see how it actually works. Those who are returning grantees have used a similar form before, so hopefully they can vouch that it is fairly easy to use, fairly user-friendly. So as we go over into the live form, you'll see it's just an Excel spreadsheet. The biggest things to remember that sometimes will trip folks up is that there are certain things, like if you try to change the word personnel, it's going to say no, because you have to have that category in your budget. So that's a locked cell. It's not going to let you change that. Same thing, if you try to change one of these totals, it's not going to let you, because it's going to say the spreadsheet knows how to total your numbers. Just let us do it. So those cells are locked just for your convenience and ease of use. But all of the ones where you're actually going to be entering your expenditures, such as that project director, you'll see I had no trouble changing that. I can put in their salary. If it was less than that, remember I can use my negative sign and then whatever amount, and it will magically do that math for me. Now, the one big tip, so everybody get ready for your one big form tip, is in many of these areas, you may need more than 2 expenditures. So let's say in supplies, I need more than 3 lines to put in expenditures. Go to that last expenditure, highlight the row, right click, and you can hit insert, and it will just pop in another row. It'll still have all the same formatting, all the same formulas for you. Depending upon your version of Excel, if you use the top line, it sometimes acts a little wonky. So I always just add from the bottom line, and it keeps it from being wonky. It'll keep all the formatting, all the formulas for you nice and pretty. If for any reason, as you're starting to use this, you have questions or you run into any issues with it, I will, as we transition back to the PowerPoint, I will pop my email over into the chat box, and you can always reach out with questions. We're here to help. All right, and so as we head back, we are right back here.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Perfect timing. So if you received an attachment 7 in your GAN, and you should have, if you have less money than in the actual award than what you proposed or requested, then that is just a signal that you would have this revised budget due no later than November 16. That's again specifically for grantees whose budgets were reduced from the original requested amount. Now that said, again, if you know you have some major budget revisions because of hiring delays or whatever, then please, by all means, feel free to submit a revision if you know you have some big changes, or just shoot me an email and say, hey, I think I might have some coming, or maybe we need to talk about it. Happy to do that as well, okay? That's all I have for today. And I know, Sarah, thank you for putting the Survey Monkey. Please, I hope you guys can go to our feedback form and let us know always what we did well and what we can do better, so that we do that for you. Sarah, anything else you want to hit on?
Yeah, and it's a super short form. It takes 2 to 3 minutes tops. You'll notice it's over in the chat box. You can click it directly from there, or copy and paste it. And then after the event today, I'll be sending out the slide deck as well as the form that you can use. I've also popped our email address over, and I'll just wrap up with our general reminder to have your contact information, and anytime you're emailing Angela, to make sure to include your PR award number.
Yes, thank you. All right, thank you, everybody.
I just want to point out, Brandon, did your question get answered about what the common exceptions are that need approval with the 10% move without approval?
Not yet.
Sarah, if you could jump back to that slide that had the prior approval list. Thanks, Kathleen.
Let's see.
There we go. So change in key personnel, change from direct to contracting of services, equipment, travel, which I would say arguably, Brandon, you do a good job of already sharing anyway when you have these types of changes. But yeah, I think in general, guys, this is where we'd want some, we'd want a heads up.
Got it.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you, everybody, for your time today. I hope this has been helpful to you, and feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions. Thanks. Have a good day.